Look, this is how children turn out because of their father. For example, that billionaire slapped the waiter in the face because there was a lot of rush in the restaurant at that time, and because of that, the food reached the billionaire a little late. Come, today I will tell you a story about a billionaire. The city glittered like a jewel in the night. Skyscrapers pierced the dark velvet sky, their glass facades reflecting streams of neon and the ceaseless glow of traffic below. In the heart of this metropolis, the exclusive district of luxury and excess boasted one of the most coveted culinary experiences in the world. Lucille Etoile, a five-star restaurant where the elite and powerful congregated to feast on delicacies prepared with the artistry of a maestro. The restaurant was known not just for its exquisite food, but for the theater of opulence it projected. Chandeliers like frozen waterfalls, waiters in perfectly pressed tuxedos gliding silently across polished marble floors, and walls adorned with original artworks whose value could rival the fortunes of entire families. Among the patrons that evening was Alexander Duval, a billionaire whose name alone could turn heads, whose presence could bend the moods of people around him. Alexander was the epitome of wealth and privilege. Impeccably dressed in a tailored midnight blue suit, diamond cufflinks glinting under the soft light, and a watch whose worth could buy a modest apartment. Beside him sat Isabella, his wife of barely 2 years, whose elegance and beauty complemented his power, a trophy of perfection in a world obsessed with status. Together, they were the kind of couple whose lives seemed scripted by a designer of fantasy and wealth. Yet behind the glossy veneer of Alexander's life, there simmered a personality that few dared to confront. He had been raised in privilege, accustomed to bending the world to his will, and every delay, every inconvenience, no matter how trivial, struck him like a personal affront. He had built an empire by crushing obstacles, dismissing incompetence, and punishing those who dared slow his path. That night, however, the world would offer him an unexpected lesson in humility, though he could not have foreseen it. The restaurant was bustling with patrons, the soft hum of conversation blending with the clinking of crystal glasses and the rustle of silk gowns. At the far end of the dining hall, Jamal, a young black waiter with dreams larger than his modest circumstances, moved between tables with careful precision. Jamal had grown up in the shadow of a city that often seemed indifferent to ambition, unless it came wrapped in the right surname or the right accent. Yet here he was, serving the rich and powerful, holding his head high despite the whispers and judgments he often endured. Each evening brought a delicate dance. Anticipate the desires of the patrons, maintain perfect composure, and hide the exhaustion that gnawed at his bones. He had learned that survival in this world required patience, humility, and grace under pressure. That night, the kitchen was unusually slow. A complicated order, involving rare ingredients flown in from distant continents, had thrown the timing off. Jamal moved swiftly, apologizing discreetly to patrons whose courses were delayed. He felt a knot of tension tightening in his chest as he approached the table where Alexander and Isabella sat, their expressions a mix of impatience and expectation. "Sir," Jamal said softly, bowing slightly, "I sincerely apologize. Your entree will be out shortly. The chef is ensuring it meets our highest standards." Alexander's eyes, icy and sharp, snapped toward him. "Shortly," he said, his voice a whip crack in the otherwise gentle murmur of the dining room. "Do you understand what shortly means? This is unacceptable. Do you know who I am?" His words were sharp, each syllable dripping with entitlement. Isabella looked at him with a flicker of discomfort, a silent plea that he calm down. But Alexander's ego was a wildfire that could not be easily tamed. Jamal's hands, steady despite the tension, tightened around the tray he carried. "Sir, I understand your frustration," he said quietly. "We will ensure your meal is served immediately." Alexander's face twisted, a mask of fury and impatience. In an impulsive surge of arrogance, he reached out and slapped Jamal across the face, a shocking act in the middle of a room filled with witnesses. The sound echoed like a gunshot. Gasps filled the air as the young waiter's head snapped to the side, a brief moment of stunned silence overtaking the restaurant. Isabella's hand flew to her mouth, horrified by her husband's brutality, while other diners stared in disbelief, whispers rippling through the hall like a wave. Jamal's body remained rigid, a blend of shock, anger, and the training he had enforced upon himself over years of service. He wanted to retaliate, to speak, to demand respect, but the reality of his circumstances forced him into silence. He bowed slightly, the faintest tremor in his voice as he replied, "Sir, please, allow me to bring your meal at once." His words, controlled and polite, carried a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the billionaire's rage. As the restaurant staff recovered from the shock, Alexander sat back in his chair, triumphant in his display of power. To him, the act was a demonstration of control, a warning to the world that he would tolerate nothing less than perfection and immediate obedience. Yet, in that moment, he did not notice the subtle shift in the room's energy, the quiet judgment in the eyes of the diners, the whispered conversations that began to swirl around him, and the unwavering calm in Jamal's posture. Behind the opulence, behind the glittering chandeliers, the foundations of Alexander's perceived superiority were quietly beginning to crack. That night, in a restaurant where wealth was worshipped and power flaunted, a single act of cruelty set into motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about himself, his status, and the nature of respect. Outside, the city continued to glitter, oblivious to the quiet revolution of dignity and pride unfolding within. And as Jamal returned to the kitchen to relay the incident, a small but resolute fire lit in his heart. A fire that would not be quenched by wealth, privilege, or fear. The echo of the slap still lingered in the dining hall long after it happened. Conversations had slowed to whispers. The previously animated hum of the five-star restaurant was now punctuated by nervous glances and uneasy murmurs. Diners who had once been engrossed in the artful presentation of their meals now found their attention drawn entirely to the incident at Alexander Duval's table. Cameras subtly captured the scene, discreetly at first, then more boldly as smartphones appeared on the table like silent witnesses. In that world, where appearances were everything, a single act of arrogance and cruelty could ripple far beyond the confines of a single evening. Isabella, Alexander's wife, was the first to break the tense silence at their table. Her fingers trembled as she reached across the table, lightly touching his arm. "Alexander, stop. This is unacceptable. You can't just hit someone." Her voice was calm but urgent, a rare combination of fear and authority that seemed almost alien to the man who had grown accustomed to total control over every environment he entered. Alexander waved her hand away dismissively, as if swatting at a bothersome insect. "Unacceptable? Unacceptable is when food arrives late. Unacceptable is when incompetence is tolerated. Don't lecture me on standards, Isabella. You don't understand the pressures of success, of maintaining the image of perfection." His words dripped with arrogance, and yet behind the bravado there was a faint tremor, a subtle crack in facade that even he was not yet ready to acknowledge. But Isabella was not so easily swayed. She had married Alexander for love, or perhaps for the illusion of it, and she had soon discovered the cold, rigid structure of his personality. The luxury, the power, and the glittering parties could not hide the harsh reality. Alexander measured life by control and dominance, and empathy was a foreign language. Now, seeing him strike a man for the delay of a meal, an act that would horrify anyone with a shred of humanity, she realized how precarious the world they had built truly was. Meanwhile, Jamal had retreated to the kitchen, his face still flushed with the sting of humiliation. The chef, a grizzled man who had seen countless wealthy patrons throw tantrums over everything from the temperature of a sauce to the alignment of a plate, placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Kid, are you okay?" he asked quietly, concern softening his rough tone. Jamal nodded, though his eyes burned with a mixture of anger and resolve. "I'm fine," he said, though the words felt inadequate even to himself. He had spent his life navigating a world that demanded obedience and humility, and yet the slap had awakened something inside him, a refusal to be diminished by wealth, race, or circumstance. That night, he realized that dignity was more valuable than silence, and courage more precious than compliance. The restaurant staff quickly attempted to contain the fallout. Waiters whispered reassurances to each other, while managers moved swiftly to smooth tensions. A junior staff member tried to apologize to Jamal for the disruption, but he waved it off. His mind was elsewhere, already spinning strategies in his head. He had to decide whether to endure this indignity silently, as he had countless times before, or to take action that might change his life forever. Alexander, oblivious to the undercurrents of resentment forming around him, leaned back in his chair, smug satisfaction flickering in his eyes. He believed he had demonstrated dominance, reinforced his superiority, and asserted control over both his environment and his spouse. Yet even as he basked in this illusion, subtle signs began to gnaw at his confidence. A few diners whispered to each other with knowing glances. Cameras were raised discreetly, and a social media storm was beginning to form. In a world where public reception was currency, Alexander had made a costly investment in humiliation. By the time they left the restaurant, the incident had already begun to ripple across the digital landscape. Photographs captured from different angles circulated online, accompanied by captions that varied from shocked outrage to subtle commentary on privilege and racial injustice. The hashtag billionaire slaps waiter began trending, attracting the attention of journalists, activists, and curious onlookers. Alexander's name, normally associated with success and sophistication, now appeared alongside terms like entitlement assault and outrage. At home, the tension between Alexander and Isabella escalated. The limousine had barely pulled away from the restaurant when Isabella spoke again, her voice measured but firm. "Alexander, we need to talk. What you did, it's not just about the waiter. It's about you, about us, about everything. You can't live in a world where you hit people and think nothing matters." Alexander's eyes narrowed, a shadow of defensiveness crossing his face. "You're overreacting. Everyone understands how things work in my world. The weak bow to the strong. That's how power is maintained." Isabella shook her head, her face pale but resolute. "No, that's not power. That's fear. And one day, fear will catch up to you." She fell silent, realizing that words might never reach him, at least not yet. The next morning, the consequences began to unfold more tangibly. Jamal had made a difficult decision overnight. He filed a formal complaint with the restaurant's corporate office, detailing the assault in precise, calm terms. He knew the risk. Alexander's wealth, influence, and connections could easily crush him. But Jamal also understood that silence had its own cost, and that dignity demanded action. Corporate executives, upon receiving the complaint, were immediately faced with a dilemma. Alexander Duval was a high-profile patron whose continued patronage was financially advantageous. But the assault of an employee could not be ignored, not in a world where public perception could destroy reputations overnight. They initiated an internal investigation, gathering statements from witnesses and reviewing security footage. It became clear that the event was not an isolated misstep, but a blatant act of aggression, captured from multiple angles, leaving little room for mitigation. As the story leaked to social media, public sentiment overwhelmingly supported Jamal. Journalists sought interviews, influencers amplified the narrative, and activists called for accountability. In a matter of hours, the billionaire who once commanded admiration and envy now faced scrutiny, condemnation, and public ridicule. Alexander, meanwhile, remained largely insulated in his penthouse, surrounded by the trappings of wealth and power. Yet even there, the weight of public opinion began to press against the walls of his carefully constructed empire. Calls from business partners and advisors became urgent, some pleading, others cautiously advising him to apologize publicly. Isabella, still grappling with disbelief and disillusionment, confronted him again. "Alexander, you need to face this. You can't ignore it. Your empire is fragile if it rests on fear and brutality." The word struck a nerve. For the first time, Alexander felt a flicker of uncertainty. His life, meticulously planned and executed, was being challenged not by a rival billionaire or a market crash, but by the dignity of a single young man and the collective judgment of society. The realization was uncomfortable, threatening the foundation of his identity, that wealth and status could insulate him from accountability. Jamal, on the other hand, found unexpected support. Former colleagues, fellow staff members, and even some patrons who had witnessed the incident privately expressed solidarity. Some offered legal advice, others moral encouragement. For Jamal, the ordeal became more than a personal battle. It was a moment of empowerment, a realization that courage, integrity, and standing up for what is right could resonate far beyond the walls of a single restaurant. By the end of the week, Alexander faced an unavoidable truth. The world no longer saw him as untouchable. News outlets published editorials dissecting the incident. Social media campaigns urged boycotts, and public opinion framed him as a cautionary tale of arrogance and abuse. The billionaire, once the embodiment of control, was now forced to confront a world where his actions had consequences beyond his immediate sphere. Meanwhile, Jamal's life began to shift subtly but profoundly. The young waiter received messages of support, offers for better employment opportunities, and recognition for his courage. His act of standing up, calm, dignified, and firm, became a catalyst for personal growth and public awareness. As the week drew to a close, Alexander and Isabella's marriage faced a critical juncture. Isabella's patience, already stretched thin, reached its limit. She saw clearly that wealth and power, while intoxicating, could never replace empathy, respect, or moral integrity. The events of that evening and the fallout that followed forced both Alexander and Isabella to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves, their marriage, and the kind of legacy they hoped to leave behind. In the reflection of his crystal wine glass, Alexander saw not a successful mogul, but a man whose pride had blinded him, whose arrogance had isolated him, and whose actions had sparked a reckoning he could neither control nor ignore. Across town, Jamal looked at his own reflection in the polished kitchen tiles and saw not just a waiter, but a man who had claimed his dignity, refused to be silenced, and ignited a change that no amount of wealth could erase. And so, the city continued to glitter, indifferent yet attentive, as two lives, once intersecting in a moment of humiliation and arrogance, now diverge along paths defined by choice, courage, and consequence. The story of the slap would not fade. It would echo as a reminder that no amount of money, status, or power could ever truly shield a person from the mirror of conscience. Section 2 focuses on immediate aftermath, public reaction, personal consequences, and a deepening tension between Alexander and Isabella, while showing Jamal's growth and empowerment. The weeks following the incident at Lucille Etoile were a storm of media scrutiny, corporate pressure, and social judgment. Alexander Duval, once untouchable in the glittering world of billionaires, now faced the consequences of a single impulsive act that had reverberated far beyond the walls of the luxurious restaurant. Every headline, every social media post, every whispered conversation carried a subtle, yet undeniable, echo of his misstep. The narrative had shifted from admiration of his wealth and success to condemnation of his arrogance, cruelty, and sense of entitlement. The boardrooms of Duval Enterprises, normally places of meticulous strategy and controlled discourse, were now battlegrounds of cautious deliberation and urgent counsel. Advisors, legal teams, and public relations experts circled around him, their faces a mixture of apprehension and quiet judgment. "Alexander, we need a strategy," one senior executive urged. "This is not just a PR problem. It's a moral problem, a societal problem. Social media doesn't forget, and the public won't forgive easily. Your reputation, and by extension our company, could take a severe hit." Alexander, sitting in his high-backed leather chair in the center of the conference room, felt a surge of frustration. He had faced market crashes, corporate espionage, and hostile takeovers. Yet none of these had unsettled him like this. Here was an attack not on his wealth or his power, but on his very image, his persona, the carefully constructed veneer that defined him. He struggled to comprehend that money alone could not buy respect, that influence alone could not shield him from morality, and that the world outside his bubble had its own rules, rules that even he could not manipulate. Isabella, meanwhile, had grown more distant. She had spent hours analyzing the situation, witnessing the slow erosion of the man she had married, and seeing firsthand the public consequences of unchecked arrogance. One evening, she confronted him once more in the solitude of their penthouse. The city light stretched endlessly beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting a world that had moved on without regard for his wealth. "Alexander," she said quietly, her tone firm yet weary, "do you even understand what's happening? People aren't just upset, they're demanding accountability. And it's not just about the restaurant or the waiter. It's about you, about who you are." Alexander's hands clenched into fists. "I did nothing wrong, Isabella. I demanded respect, and I expect standards to be met. That's not a crime." "Not a crime." Isabella's voice rose slightly, the frustration that had been simmering finally breaking through. "Slapping someone because they were late with a meal? That is not about standards. That's about power, cruelty, and ego. You humiliated him in front of everyone. Do you even realize how badly this could destroy everything we've built? For the first time, Alexander felt the weight of guilt pressing against him. His life had been a series of calculated victories. But here was a scenario where no calculation could protect him. He had underestimated the power of empathy, the influence of public opinion, and the quiet dignity of someone who refused to be cowed. Meanwhile, Jamal's life had transformed in subtle, meaningful ways. The attention he had garnered from social media, press coverage, and public support had opened doors he had only dreamed of. Offers for better positions, mentorships, and opportunities in other esteemed establishments poured in. Yet despite the attention, Jamal remained grounded, determined not to let sudden recognition distort his values or dilute the dignity that had won him this newfound respect. But the attention brought challenges as well. Jamal faced scrutiny from colleagues and acquaintances, some of whom doubted his motives or questioned whether standing up to a billionaire was truly prudent. Others, well-meaning but cautious, warned him about potential legal battles, defamation, and retaliation. The pressure to navigate newfound fame while maintaining personal integrity was immense, and Jamal wrestled with the responsibility he now carried. Every decision, every interview, every public statement had the potential to either empower or jeopardize his position. In the midst of this chaos, Alexander attempted damage control. A public apology was drafted, revised, and ultimately shelved multiple times. He hated the vulnerability it represented. The admission that a man of his power could be wronged by a public reaction. Every word of contrition felt like a chisel breaking away pieces of the identity he had so meticulously constructed. When the apology was finally issued, it was carefully worded, cold, and devoid of genuine remorse, enough to placate advisors, but not to restore public trust. The fallout was inevitable. Investors expressed unease, some distancing themselves, while activists and social media influencers continued to highlight the incident as a stark example of entitlement, abuse, and systemic inequality. Alexander's carefully curated life of control was unraveling thread by thread, not by external competition, but by the inescapable force of morality and social accountability. In the midst of his unraveling, Alexander began to reflect, though reluctantly, on the dynamics that had led to this moment. He recalled his childhood, the pressures of expectation, the lessons instilled by parents who equated love with achievement, and the constant pursuit of dominance over peers and rivals. He realized belatedly that his obsession with power and perfection had blinded him to empathy, to humility, and to the human cost of his arrogance. At the same time, Jamal's journey continued. He accepted a position at a prestigious culinary establishment, one that recognized not only his skill, but also his moral courage. His reputation as a talented and dignified professional grew, and with it came new challenges: navigating the expectations of high-profile clients, handling media attention with grace, and mentoring others who had experienced similar indignities. Each day was a balancing act. Yet Jamal approached it with calm determination, guided by principles that had been forged in adversity. The paths of Alexander and Jamal, though diverging, remained intertwined in subtle, profound ways. Alexander, once the embodiment of unchecked privilege, was forced to confront a mirror that reflected not success, but character, and the cracks that pride had left in it. Jamal, once a young man navigating a precarious world of service and survival, now stood as a symbol of resilience, dignity, and the quiet power of self-respect. One afternoon, months after the incident, Alexander visited Lucille Itoa once again, not as a patron, but under the advisement of his advisors. He wanted to gauge the impact of the incident, to understand the perspectives of those involved, and, perhaps unconsciously, to reclaim some sense of control. When he arrived, Jamal was there, moving gracefully between tables, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the fame and recognition he had received. Their eyes met briefly across the dining hall. Alexander saw in Jamal not just a young man who had endured a slap, but the embodiment of a principle he had long ignored, that dignity, courage, and integrity cannot be bought, coerced, or intimidated. Jamal, in turn, recognized the tension in Alexander's posture, the subtle unease behind the billionaire's usual air of dominance. Neither spoke, yet a silent understanding passed between them. The incident had changed them both, though in profoundly different ways. That night, Alexander returned home, haunted not by financial loss or public scrutiny, but by something far more unsettling: introspection. For the first time in his life, he grappled with the limits of wealth, the fragility of control, and the moral responsibilities that accompanied power. He began to realize that true influence was not the ability to command fear or obedience, but the capacity to inspire respect, to act with empathy, and to recognize the humanity in those who served and surrounded him. Isabella, observing this subtle transformation, recognized the potential for change, though she remained cautious. She had witnessed too many moments of hubris to assume that a single lesson could alter a lifetime of entitlement. Yet she also saw the possibility, a glimmer of hope that the man she had married, flawed as he was, might finally confront the shadows of arrogance that had defined him for so long. Meanwhile, Jamal continued to flourish, not through vengeance or resentment, but through excellence, humility, and integrity. He had transformed a moment of personal humiliation into a platform for empowerment. And in doing so, he had inspired others to recognize that dignity is a force stronger than wealth, and courage a weapon more potent than privilege. As the city lights reflected once again on skyscrapers and rivers, a subtle truth emerged from the chaos of wealth, anger, and consequence. Power, when untempered by empathy, is fragile. Dignity, when steadfast, is invincible. And a single act of injustice can ignite transformations that ripple far beyond the moment of impact. The incident at Lucille Etoile was no longer just a story about a slap. It was a narrative of awakening, accountability, and the quiet, unyielding power of moral courage. And as Alexander and Jamal moved through the complex tapestry of their lives, the world watched, learned, and remembered that true influence rests not in wealth or fear, but in character, respect, and the courage to stand for what is right. The months that followed the infamous incident at Lucille Etoile marked a period of profound transformation for both Alexander Duval and Jamal. What had begun as a single moment of impulsive cruelty had blossomed into a narrative that challenged personal values, societal perceptions, and the very nature of power. The city had not forgotten. Social media continued to reference the slap, but now the discussion had shifted from shock and outrage to introspection, analysis, and the subtle, compelling story of justice and dignity prevailing over arrogance. Alexander, once defined solely by wealth, status, and dominance, began to navigate uncharted territory: introspection. Initially, he resisted it, clinging to his ego and the comforts of his fortress-like lifestyle. But the continued public scrutiny, the whispers of investors, and the persistent disapproval of his peers created a pressure unlike any he had previously experienced. Money could buy loyalty, influence could manipulate markets, but neither could silence the quiet, insistent voice of conscience. One evening, in the quiet of his penthouse, Alexander found himself staring at the city's skyline with a sense of alienation he had never known. The sparkling lights, which once symbolized his conquest over the world, now reflected a profound emptiness. Wealth had provided him luxury, influence, and admiration, but it had not provided respect, empathy, or fulfillment. He realized that his actions had alienated those closest to him, compromised his reputation, and revealed a character flaw that even fortune could not conceal. Isabella, observing his rare moments of self-reflection, cautiously engaged with him. "Alexander, you've begun to see it," she said softly one night. "The way you wield power, the way you think dominance equals respect, it doesn't work. Not really. Not with people who matter." He nodded slowly, a tension in his jaw betraying both his internal struggle and the unfamiliarity of vulnerability. I thought I was untouchable," he admitted. "I thought fear, money, and control could protect me from everything. But I was wrong. Everything I believed, it's incomplete. I've hurt people, Isabella, and I don't know if I can undo it." "You can't undo the past," Isabella said gently, "but you can shape the future. You can choose to act differently, to listen, to respect, to recognize the humanity in others. That's power too, perhaps even more than the wealth you cling to." While Alexander wrestled with internal change, Jamal's life had entered a new chapter. Offers for positions at high-end restaurants had transformed his professional trajectory. But beyond material advancement, Jamal had discovered a deeper calling: advocacy. He began speaking at events, sharing his experiences and mentoring younger service staff who had endured humiliation or discrimination in the workplace. Each engagement reinforced his belief that dignity, courage, and integrity could catalyze change far greater than any financial reward. Yet, Jamal remained cautious. He understood that the fame stemming from Alexander's slap was not the same as lasting recognition for skill or character. He worked tirelessly, honing his craft, building a reputation based on excellence, and refusing to let anger, resentment, or opportunism guide his choices. His journey became not just a personal triumph, but a testament to resilience, humility, and the transformative power of standing up for oneself with quiet strength. Back in the world of high finance and corporate influence, Alexander faced practical consequences. Some investors withdrew support, citing ethical concerns. Philanthropic organizations distanced themselves, and media coverage continued to frame him as a cautionary tale. These external pressures forced him to take meaningful actions. He issued a public apology, this time not the cold, calculated words crafted months before, but a sincere acknowledgement of wrongdoing and a commitment to change. He established programs to support staff dignity in the workplace, funded initiatives promoting quality in service industries, and began personal mentorship to understand perspectives he had previously dismissed. Alexander's transformation was neither instant nor complete. Pride, ego, and old habits still challenged him daily. But the incident at Lucille Etoile had cracked the armor he had built around himself, revealing the possibility of humility and moral growth. He learned to navigate power with empathy, to lead with respect rather than fear, and to recognize that true authority derived from character, not wealth. Jamal and Alexander's paths eventually cross again, not by coincidence, but through deliberate reconciliation. Alexander requested a private meeting, acknowledging his previous mistakes and offering an opportunity for dialogue. Jamal, though cautious, agreed, understanding that this moment was not about vengeance, but about closure, acknowledgement, and mutual growth. They met in a quiet room at a neutral location, away from cameras, social media, and public scrutiny. Alexander, dressed simply, without the ostentatious display of wealth that had once defined him, extended a hand. Jamal, I want to apologize, not for appearances, but genuinely. I was wrong and I acted cruelly. I hope one day you can forgive me. Jamal studied him carefully, the memory of humiliation still fresh but tempered by the journey he had undertaken. He saw the subtle sincerity in Alexander's demeanor, the effort to confront uncomfortable truths rather than dismiss them. Finally, he nodded. I accept your apology. But more importantly, I hope you truly understand what respect, dignity, and responsibility mean, not just in public, but in life. The conversation, brief yet profound, marked a turning point. It was not about erasing the past, nor about declaring one party victorious. It was about acknowledging human imperfection, understanding consequences, and striving toward betterment. In the months that followed, both men continued to grow in their respective spheres. Alexander became an advocate for ethical leadership, using his influence to implement fair labor practices, support mentorship programs, and raise awareness about the responsibilities accompanying wealth. He discovered that respect and influence gained through empathy had a far more enduring impact than intimidation or fear. Jamal, continuing his culinary and advocacy work, gained recognition not just for his talent, but for his integrity. He became a symbol of resilience and moral courage, inspiring others to navigate their challenges with dignity rather than compromise their principles. His story spread beyond the culinary world, resonating in communities where injustice, humiliation, and systemic inequality had once seemed insurmountable. The incident that had once seemed like a moment of chaos and cruelty evolved into a lasting lesson. That power unchecked by empathy becomes fragile, that dignity cannot be bought or coerced, and that a single courageous act can catalyze transformations far greater than the wealth or status of any individual. Years later, the story of the slap at Lucille Etoile became emblematic in social discussions, media analysis, and even academic study, a case of accountability, growth, and the subtle, undeniable truth that character outweighs wealth and courage outweighs fear. It reminded a world fascinated by fame and fortune that no matter the heights of success, the moral compass, integrity, respect, and empathy remains the ultimate measure of a person. As the city continued to glitter under neon lights and skyscrapers, Alexander and Jamal moved forward, shaped by the same event yet changed in fundamentally different ways. Alexander, humbled and introspective, sought redemption through action, learning that influence requires responsibility. Jamal, empowered and resolute, transformed adversity into opportunity, embodying the quiet, lasting strength of dignity and principle. The echo of that slap, once a symbol of cruelty, had transformed into a lesson for all that human decency, courage, and empathy are forces far more enduring than wealth, power, or social status. And in that realization, both men found a measure of peace, understanding, and the possibility of a future defined not by ego, but by the quiet, enduring strength of character.